Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. Today I'm going to be covering something called thumbnail sketching, which you may have heard of before. They're basically a way to quickly note down ideas for drawings and paintings, and they can be useful for both abstract and representational work. They give you an opportunity to test out lots of different compositions and proportions. You can do this just by kind of placing major shapes and masses or lines in quite a small sort of space to sort of have a look at how something works in a very general sense before adding any detail or moving into like a larger piece. We generally try to keep them quite small just because they're more manageable and you can do more at a time. You want to try to make your thumbnails different proportions, so use kind of different ratios. So if you were drawing the same scene, you could test out whether it works well as a square format or a kind of standard rectangle or a very wide rectangle, whether it works better upright or horizontally. It's a good opportunity to test out those sorts of variations before you decide on what sort of size canvas you might use or paper and that sort of thing. When you're drawing it, you want to kind of think about, imagine that the image that you're drawing is being looked at through squinted eyes, so that all that you can really see are the major lines and the major masses. This will allow you to keep things fairly simple, so you just draw a few major lines and you just add in the kind of major sort of value groups. You might use, I don't know, 2 or 3 values, something like that in a thumbnail sketch. Even typically 2 values, so just black and white, is a good way to kind of test out how something looks. So you can be as loose as you like. There's no, we're not looking for precision with thumbnails. Ideally we want kind of less precision and more variation, because that allows you to kind of look at things more comparatively and kind of start opening up options for more finished work. You can also introduce colour to your thumbnails. So these thumbnails I'm going to be working on, I'm actually just using a very simple 8B pencil, and this is just an introduction. So thumbnails are really experimental, as I say. So even if you're even if you're keeping things quite simple in terms of shapes, lines or masses, you can start adding in colour. If colour is quite important to your composition, then by all means do colour thumbnails. You can start to expand the size of your thumbnails to be a lot bigger than what I'm going to do today. But this is just an introduction to kind of give you a general overview. It's the sort of thing you'll do in your sketchbook mostly. Once you're done with your thumbnail, so once you've kind of created a sheet of thumbnails, which is what I'm going to be demonstrating, I recommend that you kind of go through everything that you've done and pick the thumbnails you think work the best, your favourites, and try to think about and start to write about why they work, what it is about them that works better than the others, because they'll be quite similar to each other, and certain thumbnails will certainly stand out as more effective as very basic compositions. And from that point you can take your kind of favourite thumbnails and work them up into a bigger thumbnail, or work them up into a kind of sort of mock version of your final piece. And you can start to use kind of greater value range and more complex shapes and more colours, that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, that pretty much covers it as far as an introduction to what a thumbnail is. I'm just going to go about showing you sort of how I would draw them on a sheet of paper, just give you guys some sort of direction. So generally, if I've got a sketchbook page, and I was producing a set of thumbnails from life, so I might have a location, I might be in a town or something like that, and I'm sitting in a square and I want to test out different views from a single position in the square. I'll begin on my page by drawing sort of an array of different sized boxes, all really small. So there's obviously a reason they're called thumbnails, so that's bigger than my thumbnail, but still a pretty tiny box. So I'll draw a variety of sizes, so do one that's a little bit bigger there, do one very tall narrow one, So you can draw them. You can draw your box each time you start doing a new thumbnail. I tend to prefer to do it this way. To draw them all before I actually start, partly because I'm not sort of thinking at all about the composition, not limiting myself in any way when I first start drawing, and also because I can kind of say, pick a part of a scene and look at a square box and think, oh, how do I fit that into that square box, rather than having to sort of look at the scene, imagine what kind of size I want, and then draw it on the paper. Because you will find that you'll kind of you'll have a bias towards certain certain compositions, and your brain will start to kind of regulate what you're looking at. So it's a great opportunity to kind of have a bit more variety in what you're doing. But yeah, I mean, that's probably, I'll do a couple more just so you get a decent variety. But that's pretty much it. So depending on the size of your page, if you're using a smaller sketchbook, you could do smaller thumbnails, or just have fewer on each page. But something like this, so you have an array of boxes, you're looking at your scene, or it is equally applicable to sort of abstract work, so feel free to use this sort of technique to develop ideas without any kind of reference at all. So if I was drawing some sort of landscape, I might pick this box and I'll say my horizon line is kind of low down in the image. There might be some sort of building along the horizon line kind of emerging up, might be a little clump of trees, and those are my two sort of major shapes. And if the sky is quite bright, you'll find the ground and the tree and the house all end up being a similar sort of value. So you sketch them in, shade them in, and you pretty immediately got a very, very simple compositional sketch of that scene. And you can start to think about what it is about those two shapes that work well together, or if they don't work well. If I took exactly the same scene, and let's say I placed it into, let's say I had a much higher horizon line, but in a vertical format, so it kind of feels more like we're looking up at it. Again, have a building, tree to the side, shaded in again to separate it from the sky. So you can see I've now got, if I kind of go back and just re-emphasize the boundaries of these two shapes, we've now got two identical scenes in terms of what we're depicting, but very different compositions. So this image feels more regular. The horizon falls kind of just above 1/3 of the image, or possibly actually on about 1/3, which is fairly conventional. Top of the building is just about the 2/3 of the image. It's kind of symmetrical, and it's kind of fairly pleasing. But I would say this one, looking at the two of them, this one feels more dynamic. It's kind of interesting that you have this space. Your eye is kind of, it kind of gives a certain kind of gravity to what you're looking at in terms of this part of the scene. They're higher up, so they feel more prominent. You kind of feel like your eye is led up towards them. So already, even with just that kind of two shapes, basically, one dark shape, one light shape, you have this sense of what the composition is about, what it makes you feel as a viewer. And this is what thumbnails are really good for, allowing you to explore these sorts of possibilities. So if you had like a multi-layered, so if we move to a different sort of scene now, you might have something like some hills in the background, then a hill in the foreground that slopes back, then some trees along that line of that hill, and then in the very foreground again you might have some kind of building kind of here, and it might be that the kind of further away you get, the lighter the image becomes, something to do with where the light is. So we'll create 3 different values in this image. I shall go for 4. So you have this kind of middle ground hill, the trees at the top, got this dark building in the foreground, and then the slightly lighter again hillside in the background. It might take you a little bit longer to balance out your tones with this sort of piece. You can see that's pretty much starting to emerge. And it allows you to see how, now that we've got multiple shapes, how those multiple shapes interact. So you might look at it and feel like, well, it's a bit kind of slightly dull the way that these 2 shapes kind of mimic each other somewhat. It might be more interesting if you had this shape come this way, and then maybe rather than sort of sitting directly underneath, the second hill could maybe slope slightly against it. You might have one tree there and then a few more clumps down here. Maybe the building sits in a slightly different way within the foreground of the image. So you can see this image, maybe not perfect, but probably makes for something slightly more dynamic than the initial image, in that these 2 lines, these 2 kind of dominant lines in the hillsides cross each other rather than just sort of sitting over the top of each other. So when you're creating these sorts of thumbnails, you can kind of start to look at what works well or doesn't work well in terms of how things, how different shapes intersect with one another, whether they seem too regular, too repetitive, or whether they're quite dynamic, quite interesting. Something else you can start to look at in thumbnail compositions is balance within the composition. So if you've got, say you have quite a wide image, and you had some sort of large dark shape, make it quite amorphous, maybe it's like a bunch of trees or something like that. On this side of the composition, to create a sense of balance, some sort of sense of dynamic balance, you would either need to, if we call this the center of the image, you'd need an equally sort of dark, similar volume mass on the other side, or you could create a smaller, darker mass nearer the very edge of the image, and that actually starts to play in something called, I think it's called dynamic composition. And it's something that we'll look at in a future lesson, but essentially the idea is that you need to create some sort of balance, and a very dark, small point within say a large field of light close to the edge of the canvas has a similar kind of compositional weight to a much larger volume that's nearer the center of the image. If that was very light, or if it was, say, here or something like that, it would still tip the kind of balance of the composition down to the left. And it basically plays on the idea of a fulcrum, so it depends where your fulcrum is and the weight that it's holding. So if you've got something kind of small near the center, you'll get a certain balance. But it's something to kind of play around with and bear in mind as you're working. The other thing that you can do with thumbnails, so if you've got different types of shapes, so we've looked at sort of balance of lines to a certain extent in these sort of in these landscape compositions. If you're just working with pure shapes, you can start to use thumbnails as a way to play around with difference between rectangles or triangles and circles, that sort of thing, and how they fill the image. It's also useful for looking at compositions for different types of subjects. So something else that kind of benefits from a thumbnail approach certainly would be portraiture. So if you had a specific pose that someone is sitting for you at, or a certain pose they're sitting, and you know that, say, the head is here, very regular pose we'll say for this one, and their body is sort of something like that, say their arms are quite flat, and you just want to look at them as a kind of negative shape against, say, a light background in this instance, then if it was cropped square, you would know that sort of what you can get out of that figure or that subject is something along these lines. And if you were then to change to a taller, more rectangular, composition, you suddenly see that you can fit a lot more of the figure into that image, and it might affect your sort of decision on what sort of size image you would be working on. So obviously, if you want the head to be a certain scale and you were working in a square composition, you know that your canvas can be a lot smaller relatively than this taller composition. So you'd end up with quite a tall piece, and it's something you can kind of figure out while you're working on your thumbnail. So what do you necessarily want out of it? If you were to do the same composition in a very wide canvas, you would lose even more of the body probably. But you'd end up with quite an interesting composition, something more cinematic in a way. Wider boxes tend to kind of create a sense of a cinematic feel to an image, because we associate those sorts of wide formats with cinema. You also have a lot of this empty space where if the viewer, or if the subject was kind of looking that way, then their kind of, the attention that they focus on this space becomes something that fills the space with weight, talking about balance. So that's quite interesting as well, that kind of, it gives something for the subject to interact with, rather than it be kind of a very tight, focused image, like this sort of square piece. And as I say, you can kind of start to bring these to kind of more complex completions. So if you're working on, go back to this original one, you wanted to give some sort of definition to where the light is coming from, you can do that. So in this case, obviously it feels like the light's coming from this direction. If you wanted to sketch in sense of some clouds or something like that, and maybe add a third value, you can start to create a more complex scene. You can definitely keep working into them as you go, so you make them more complex. You could pick the ones that you like best to make them more complex. But as you see, it's mostly just a case of kind of playing around with ideas, so looking at how you divide shapes up. What happens if you put more or less heavy value into shapes that are existing in the space, what that does to your eye, how it feels, just in these sorts of really tiny spaces. I mean, I can do each of them in a matter of seconds. And it just allows you to kind of test so many different things out in a much faster kind of process than if you were to take photos yourself, or if you were to just kind of go straight into an image, go straight into a painting without having planned it all. So definitely recommend it as a little tool to use, something to add to your sketching repertoire. Something to do when you've got a tiny bit of free time. You can do a tiny little landscape sketch if you're sitting around waiting for something in outdoors somewhere. Loads of opportunities to kind of play around with thumbnail sketching. And I think that pretty much covers it, so hopefully that's an interesting enough introduction. I'll be doing some follow-up lessons where you can look at using colour and different types of mediums, bringing them to kind of a more complex finish, and that's pretty much it. It's a pretty simple one, this one, so hopefully you guys enjoyed trying your hand at your own little thumbnails, and I look forward to seeing any of your work. See you guys soon.